Good evening, everybody. This is Kiana, and I hope you're having a happy Halloween and getting some candy, going out trick or treating, and I hope your costumes are nice. I saw some very interesting and unique costumes out in Belfast, and it made me think that I should have dressed up this Halloween, but I decided to stay in and kick it with you guys and kind of go over some stories that are in the headlines. So we're going to get into that. There is a story that is currently circulating in the headlines that is out of a movie, and it is reminiscent of Lakeview Terrace. Now, if you haven't seen Lakeview Terrace, it's an American film where the actor is Samuel A. Jackson and Kerry Washington is in the film. And so Kerry Washington is in an interracial relationship with um, a white male, and they are married and they move into a new neighborhood, and Jackson is their neighbor, and he is also a police officer. And one of the disturbing things about this film is that Samuel A. Jackson, of course, in this movie, is dislikes their relationship, dislikes that Kerry Washington is in an interracial relationship, and so he begins to engage in a lot of different methods, such as uh, turning on bright lights at night. Like, I forget what these lights are called, but the bright lights that you have on your vehicle, and sometimes those bright lights on like Mack trucks. So he had those bright lights on his house, and he would them toward their window while they were sleeping. So they have like this bright light shining in their windows while they were asleep. And he would do a number of things to just covert harassment. So he would engage in a covert harassment campaign. And I think that in the film, things kind of turned violent and took the wrong direction. And it's quite unfortunate. But that movie, if I'm not mistaken, is based on a true story that a police officer actually did engage in this harassment campaign of his interracial neighbors who were married and put them through a multitude of intimidation, harassment, etc. And so there is a real life story. So coming that's quite similar to Lakeview Terrace, unfortunately. And this isn't a laughing matter. I think it's just shocking that there is a real life story, and it's coming out of Minneapolis. And the victim, his name is David Matori. And so David Matori moved into his home in 2023, and he unfortunately was in the neighborhood, and his neighbor was a man who, so David Matori, just a little bit more about him. He's a black man. He's married to a white female, and they are happily married. And so they live next to a white male. His name is John Herbert Shawshank, I think. And unfortunately, they've gone through similar harassment campaigns that we see in the Lakeview Terrace movie. For instance, what John would do is, while the couple was sleeping at night, he would be screaming and yelling and uh, sounding off air horns to deprive them of sleep. So, of course, he was engaging in this sleep deprivation campaign. And he would also harass them, threaten them, hurl racial slurs at them, and really just make their life really difficult. And if you can think about it, Matori and his wife, but mainly David, was harassed for approximately a year. And what also happened is that David actually called law enforcement 19 times, 19 times. And nothing happened. And I think David stated to the degree that he was in fear of his life and that his neighbor was, of course, engaging in this harassment campaign, and that he also stated that, yeah, that he felt very uncomfortable because of some of the things that his neighbor was doing, and I think he attempted to file a restraining order on the neighbor John, and it has become clear through reports that several neighbors have filed restraining orders on John. And it's unfortunate because despite calling law enforcement 19 times and reporting this, law enforcement did not take action. And David contacted the chief of police. He contacted the mayor. He contacted the city council members. He contacted the Department of Human Rights, and still no one took action. And so one day, David was outside his home and I think he was just kind of doing some lawn work and cutting down a tree. And perhaps that may have been interpreted by law enforcement as, a covert way or a microaggression to hit back at his neighbor. We don't know because the mayor said, I think the chief said that, um, what was his words exactly? He said, the chief said that the incident happened because of the actions precipitated by the victim. And so I'm trying to think of what those actions are and what we see in the film, right? The footage that is being published, what we see is that David is out doing lawn work. He's cutting down a tree, and unfortunately, he is shot by his neighbor. And I believe that this bullet hit his spine. And so in the footage, you can see him drop to the ground. His head hits the concrete. And for several days, they don't arrest Shawshank. They don't arrest him for several days. And Matori was concerned. He was like, "I'm trying to figure out," and he's stating this in his hospital bed. I'm trying to still understand why my neighbor hasn't been arrested. So you can imagine a crime was committed. This man almost took another man's life. He shot him, and after that crime occurred, wasn't arrested for several days. Just a moment. So he wasn't arrested for several days. Let me adjust my microphone. So he wasn't arrested for several days. And one of the a rationale or justification behind this decision was that John Herbert Shawshank allegedly had a mental illness. So I want to kind of juxtapose this case with the Elroy Clark case because, as we know, we have two situations in which two people are alleged to have a mental illness. So we have Shawshank, who has just shot his neighbor, and then we have Elroy Clark, who is uh, contesting a trespass warrant, and stating very clearly that he does not have a warrant out for his arrest, that he has not trespassed, and he becomes agitated and quite combative. And in both scenarios, law enforcement, they allegedly, it is put out there to the public that law enforcement understand that both of these persons have a mental illness. But when we focus on the actions, right, of law enforcement, we can kind of see that it's quite different, right? Because, and I understand that these are two different states. So we have one in Minneapolis and then we have one in Florida. But universally, law enforcement training is quite the same across all states. And I want to pay attention to the actions, right, taken by law enforcement, because in the Clark case, we understand that law enforcement, they don't do several things that they did in the Shawshank case. And I will concede that law enforcement did use a number of control methods. So they tried to do a taser, beanbag, directives, right? And so I'm not disputing that. That's not to be disputed. But but we could agree that what's different, markedly different from the Shawshank case, is that Clark didn't murder anyone. Excuse me, Clark didn't shoot anyone. So he didn't shoot anyone. Clark didn't have any weapons on him, and Clark didn't engage in a harassment campaign for a year and didn't threaten anyone for over a year. And in that scenario with Clark, what happened was that he was unalived. Whereas in this scenario with Shawshank, he engaged in a harassment campaign for over a year. And he had weapons on him. And not only did he have weapons on him, he shot his neighbor, which made this man highly dangerous, like extremely dangerous. And so, despite the severity of the danger, the imminent danger that Shawshank put his neighbor in and the community, law enforcement refused to arrest him because they said that they were afraid. And Matori raises a good question. He says, and it's an important question as well. He says, well, if law enforcement is afraid to arrest Shawshank and afraid of him, then how do you, like, what do you expect from us? Like, we're afraid as well. Like, how do you expect for us to feel? Like, we're afraid, and yet you guys have riot gear, you have SWAT gear, or SWAT equipment. You have the whole police force behind you, and we don't have any of that, and you are afraid of this person. And so you can kind of see that there are some disparities between these two cases, right? And yes, Matori also says that law enforcement, they have body armor. And Matori does not have body armor. Obviously, he got shot, and I think that bullet hit his spleen, and luckily, like, it didn't paralyze him. But what was also different in this case is that what law enforcement did was they contacted Shawshank's family and tried to gather information on his mental health. They also allegedly consulted a psychiatrist, and then they engaged with crisis negotiators to in an attempt to contact him. All of the so all of these methods of control were not utilized in the Elroy Clark case, despite Clark not having a history of violence, despite Clark not having any weapons on him, and actually Clark being able to articulate himself and the reasons why he called the police on the day in question. So, as you can see, there are a number of disparities in this particular case. And Matori and his wife, they were not secure. They were persistently harassed by their neighbor who kept them up at night, who engaged in this harassment campaign by releasing air horns every night, also just calling them horrific names, racial slurs, etc. And I think this it raises the question, ladies and gentlemen, right? So On one occasion, Shawshank brandished a knife. He showed that to, or intimidated and threatened the couple with a knife. And even after that phone call to law enforcement, nothing happened. He wasn't arrested. And remember that the reports are stating that 19 times, it took 19 times, 19 times, and still no action. No action from law enforcement whatsoever. And so it makes us think, it raises an important question about what justice is in the United States, right? Like, what is justice? And can Black people rely on law enforcement? Can we call law enforcement? Because what these two cases have in common is that two Black men contacted law enforcement. And in both situations, law enforcement failed the victims. Law enforcement either didn't deliver on justice, didn't arrest the perpetrators, or law enforcement actually assumed that the victim was the perpetrator. So it's quite unfortunate. So I want you just to really just ponder on that for a moment. I think it's important for us to really kind of think and ponder on this. And again, it raises that question as to what is justice? What is justice in the United States for Black Americans who are victimized in their neighborhoods? What is justice? And I have something last to say that the last thing I'm going to say is shame on Jacob Fry, the mayor. Shame on the mayor for taking that long to address this concern, to ignoring Davis Matori's case. Shame on the chief for saying that the victim precipitated the actions. Now, again, what could have happened is that the victim could have got so frustrated with being harassed for over a year, constantly, that he decided to stand up for himself in a way that was not belligerent and not aggressive, but maybe it was passive aggressive. And that's disputable as to whether or not that is the right course of action. But we need to remember that he didn't have law enforcement on his side. Law enforcement wasn't protecting him. He called law enforcement officers 19 times, and law enforcement officers ignored his plight. And I would just want to say that shame on the mayor, to reiterate, shame on the mayor and shame on the chief for letting this complaint go unaddressed and depriving the victim in this case of redress. Shame, shame, shame. A person who is harassed and intimidated, they should not have to go through months and months of harassment and intimidation. And law enforcement failed to come to their aid. And it raises a question, it raises an important question. Why didn't law enforcement take Matori's case seriously? What was it about this particular case that they felt didn't warrant police intervention? I don't buy the excuse that Shaw Chank was dangerous or that Shawshank was has a mental illness, because of course we see time and time again that law enforcement officers, they often, that's your job. Your job is to deal with dangerous people, right? Your job is to deal with criminals, right? Your job is to ensure that the public is safe from people who pose a legitimate threat to society. And it's really unfortunate that I could just imagine what David Matori went through for that entire year, that harassment that continued to happen without any intervention, and being gaslighted and race slighted by the mayor and law enforcement and city council members and all those people that he went to address his concerns, being gaslighted, being race slighted, being told that his complaint is not that serious. And ladies and gentlemen, I am willing to bet you, I'm willing to really bet you that the perpetrator, Shawshank, I'm willing to bet you that he has a connection with law enforcement somewhere. I'm willing to bet you that that is what prevented him from being arrested and why he stayed out of jail for so long after he shot his neighbor. So, what do you think about this case? Like, do you think that he should have been arrested sooner? Do you think that police was right when they waited to arrest him? Do you think that I'm wrong? Do you think that the arguments that I raise are just far fetched? Do you think that they are within reason and um, rational? Do you think that Matori was wrong? Do you think that Shawshank was right? What are your opinions? Let me know. I want to hear. So, but before I end this video, I forgot to tell you that it's important that we push these kinds of videos in the up in the algorithm, because what it does is it brings awareness about community violence. It brings awareness about harassment campaigns and victimology. And I think it's important for us to really help each other out so that we can explore these topics together. And that is why I'm asking you to subscribe to this channel. And I'm asking you to like this video, and that um, share it with others, and to have a discussion about it. Like, tell me what you think. Tell me what other people think about it. Uh, Raise questions about the content within it. Ask yourself questions about this particular situation. Again, we cannot let cyber hackers win. We can't let governments win who are seeking to silence dissent. We can't let them win. We are on the right side of justice. We are talking about justice. We are talking about protecting human rights within the confines of the law. We're not outside the margins of the law. We are doing everything right. And it is the cyber hackers and the colluders that are participating with the US government and the Republic of Ireland who is seeking to silence dissent and is seeking to exonerate and absolve people who are engaging in criminality. So I would say that we stand together peacefully, in that we continue to talk about these issues, not be ashamed to talk about them, not be afraid to talk about them, because what this does is it affects us as a community. We need to be able to have these conversations. And yes, they're difficult, but they are necessary conversations to have. And it's for that reason I'm asking for your support and liking this video, sharing this video, subscribing to this channel, and also asking for your support to give me advice, help me to build myself in a way that I can talk about these issues intelligently and more in a thought-provoking manner uh, that seeks discussion and respectful debate. And for that, I'll tell you good night.